My name is Katherine Stanley, and I'm a research associate here at the University of Manitoba, working with Dr. Martin Entz in the Natural Systems Agriculture program. The CombCut is a unique mechanical weed control tool that originated in Europe to control curled dock, and recently it's been used in North America. And how it works is the CombCut goes below the crop canopy, selectively managing weeds that have a rigid stem. So this has been commonly used for wild mustard, but has also been shown to be quite effective in thistle, and that's what we'll be demonstrating here today. When the CombCut is in operation, these blades go below the crop canopy. These brushes will spin the crop and the weeds against the blades. Anything that has a loose stem or not a rigid stem, like your crop, in this example oats, should flow freely through the blades, whereas anything with a rigid stem or hard leaves, such as the thistles, should be cut off directly at the blades. The blades can be adjusted based on the crop type and the stage. By adjusting the aggressiveness of the blades, you can either take off more of the stems that maybe aren't quite as rigid, or you can release the aggressiveness if you find that you're cutting your crop leaves. The angle of the blades can be changed up or down, as well as the positioning, the angle of the blades left to right. It's important to monitor the crop stage to the weed stage when using the CombCut. If the crop has started to develop a flag leaf or a rigid stem, you'll need to raise the height of the implement or reduce the aggressiveness so you're not cutting your crop. As you can see, this is the first pass we've done through the field. We were going quite quickly and fairly aggressively with the blades. We were able to manage most of the thistles that we passed through, but we were also cutting off a few of the leaves of the oat crop. So this is definitely something that needs to be taken into consideration before applying a CombCut to your entire field, and should be adjusted to minimize any damage to the crop itself. So I'm standing here through this oat field where we've just applied the CombCut. This was the first pass we did before we made any adjustments. You can see right in front of me, where we have not applied it, that the oats and mustard are still within the crop canopy and above the crop canopy. This will definitely cause some competitive stress on this oat stand as the season progresses. And if you come a little closer into the oat field, you can see where we have been able to successfully cut the thistles, and there is no visible damage to the oat crop, so that's ideal, what you want. Okay, so as you can see, we were able to manage the thistles below the crop canopy. This will not completely eliminate the return of weeds to the seed bank. However, it will substantially reduce the rate of growth of the thistles and allow the oats to become more competitive as they grow over top of the thistle patches. So any weeds such as these thistles or mustard that are at too early of a stage we weren't able to control with this pass, This thistle still has a rigid stem, so we may have been able to have successful control with either increasing our speed or decreasing the depth within the crop canopy. However, this is another example why a weed stage to crop stage is important in the success of this mechanical weed control implement. Another thing, in addition to crop damage, when deciding the depth of the implement, is to consider if you have large rocks or stones within your field. As you can see here, we had a bit of contact with a rock on this blade, which caused these blades to lift, creating the damage you see on the brushes here. So that's just one other thing that you need to keep in mind when setting the depth on the machine. We're standing in a substantial patch of Canada thistle. The CombCut is a mechanical weed control tool that we can use later in the growing season to help combat this weed. However, it is important to know that the CombCut cannot be the only solution to proper management of perennial weeds such as Canada thistle, but it must be used in combination with good agronomic practices such as seeding rate, good fertility, other forms of early seed weed management, and a strong crop rotation. The CombCut is a tool that can also be used with conventional farmers managing herbicide resistance later in the growing season, and may also have a possibility of use to manage volunteer canola above the crop canopy in soybeans. As the height of the CombCut can be adjusted throughout the growing season, you can start within the crop canopy, but it also has the ability to be used above the crop canopy once the crop has gotten to the stage that it can no longer be used within the canopy itself.
My name's Andrew Harris. We farm near Stony Mountain. We have 300 acres organic, and we have about 700 acres in transition, and we have about 260 acres in conventional. This is a wheat crop that is in transition. We used the CombCut on it this year to try control thistles. We were fairly pleased with it. We only did one pass in about the 4-leaf stage, and if we had it for a second pass, it would have helped a lot more on thistles, and it did a good job. We were happy with control of thistles. So I was probably getting about 80 to 90% of the thistles. It was cutting the tops off, the buds off. Some regrew, some died, and didn't create buds on some of them ones that the buds were cut off. It was a good machine on thistles. What I didn't like was when you unfold it, it didn't cut well between the two sections, like where it joined up. So that's one thing I didn't like. Like back here, where but also right here, like that one, it just got cut off and never. I would probably try and build my own or get one engineered here and get one built, just for some modifications and slightly different design for better flow of crop material when you're cutting, and also maybe to mount on a self-propelled swather or on a front 3-point hitch. I broke a couple knives. I never broke just the blades and not the mechanism. I think we lost one section, like one section where the knife bolts on. The support wires came loose, and as we were using it, wrapped around the reel and bent the reel a bit. So it just came off and then wrapped up on the reel. I can get good nutrients in the ground, like good soil fertility, but what's drawing us back is the weed control is hard, and then that's taking my yield away. So like I'm interested in building a robo-crop weeder for in between the rows, and then in the future either building a CombCut or a similar design. This is a transition wheat crop we had, heavy weed pressure in it. It looks very dirty. There's a strip of thick thistles, and that's where we never use the CombCut, and then the thistles on each side is where we cut down the thistles quite a bit. It would have been good to do a second pass a couple weeks later when they started to sprung back up, or when they grew new shoots. And then we had wild oats pressure, and if I had a CombCut, I would have cut the tops of the wild oats off to try and keep it from seeding down. This is just a bad area of the field, but it's just a good example of where we use the CombCut and where we haven't used the CombCut. Okay, this is an organic einkorn field of mine. It had a lot of mustard issues. This is an area we use the CombCut. It did a good job of cutting the mustard down and getting light to the plants, and after cutting it, the mustard did grow back again, but it gave a chance for the einkorn to come through the mustard canopy. And einkorn is just slow to start growing, so the mustard just kind of got ahead of it for a bit until we CombCut. There is an area over this way that we haven't used the CombCut, and the mustard just looks a little bit thicker in that area. When we were CombCutting, we had challenges with the mustard flowing through the machine. It just wanted to catch on the framework and didn't want to flow through the machine, and then we had issues with plugging. Then you were ripping plants out instead of cutting them off. And then also in the center section where it unfolds, it didn't want to cut on the mustard there, and it would plug on the knife. We made it a little more aggressive for the mustard because Canada thistle cut a little easier than the mustard, so we had to make it more aggressive. And then we were probably down about 3 inches into the einkorn plant material. If we went any lower, we found we cut the einkorn off. We were just worried that it wouldn't grow back as well. So there was a bit of a crop difference between wheat and einkorn. The einkorn was a little more grassy, so it flowed a little better, and it was a little earlier stage, so it flowed around the knives better than with the wheat. The wheat was a little later, and it cut more of the top leaves off the wheat, so we less aggressive on the wheat. Cutting a little bit of the wheat off, I don't think it affected the wheat at all. We only did 1 pass, but I think by doing a second pass, it would have helped to control the second flush of mustard coming in, because the second flush came back pretty quick. So by doing a second pass, we would be able to get more of the mustard down again. I think it would pay off to do a second pass. In the future, my goal would be to get into more of a no-till system, using cover crop to smother out weeds, and using CombCut to control the weeds in crop, and then just cover crops before and after. I think is a good method to control weeds, and that's the way I'd like to go. The biggest issue with that is getting ahead of the weeds. And so on our last 2 fields that are conventional, my goal is to control the weeds before I get them, and get enough trash and coverage on the soil to choke them out before I bring it into the organic system. So I think that'd be my goal.
That's great.
Hi, my name is Kirk, and I'm an organic farmer just outside of Stanford, Manitoba. This is my first year of a certified organic crop. I used the CombCut this year in my wheat crop when the wheat was just before stem elongation. So the wheat was probably about 10 inches tall, maybe 12 inches tall, to control thistles. As you can see, I'm standing in a thistle patch. So we do have some thistle problems, and I was hoping to use the CombCut to chop off the thistles while they're growing in the wheat and have the wheat gain a competitive advantage over the thistle crop. So when I used the CombCut, I just used a few passes in the field. We did have some issues getting the knives set up properly, so I found it challenging to set up the knives so that they were cutting the thistles, and we also had wild mustard that I was hoping to control, and not cutting the wheat. When I first set it up, I pretty much chopped everything off. Then we readjusted it so it was looser, and tried to tighten it up so it was just cutting a good amount of thistles and wild mustard and not cutting too many wheat plants. Last year in this field we had a green manure crop of peas and oats. We did have some thistles and weeds in the green manure crop. We tilled it under mid-July. And I was hoping to seed another crop, but we actually had some thistle patches that I was hoping to control. So we did do some tillage in August, and then in late August, September, October, it was really wet, and we didn't really get a chance to come back in and do more tillage as I was hoping to. So then this spring, I obviously planned on planting wheat. Before planting wheat, I cultivated twice to try to reduce some of the weeds. Cultivated twice, planted my wheat, and then harrowed. Because of all that tillage, we actually had a really good seed bed that we went into, and it was pretty weed-free, probably for about 3 weeks after seeding. One of the issues with the spring tillage instead of the fall tillage is that I did end up drying the soil out quite a bit in the spring, and my wheat came up probably about 7 days later than wheat that was also planted on the farm that wasn't tilled in the spring. So because of that late start with the wheat, and I think we also had some poor germination this year because we were planting into fairly dry soils that stayed dry, we didn't have as thick of a plant stand as I was hoping for, and then we had less competitive wheat. because of that slow start and the thinner plant stand due to the really dry conditions in the spring. So all of those factors sort of compounded to have more of a thistle population than I would have liked to have this year, and also more wild oats than I would have liked to have. When we used the CombCut, I think we may have used it a bit earlier than I would like to try in the future. So the thistles weren't above the wheat when we used it. They were actually a little bit below the wheat, and they were pretty thin and spindly. So I think one of the reasons why we didn't have great control is because the thistles were pretty thin. They didn't have any of the nice, thick stalks that you would probably cut a little bit easier with the CombCut. So most of the thistles probably were a little bit taller than this and just a little bit thicker than this. So the stems were pretty flexible when we were going in to control the thistles with the CombCut. The wild mustard, we did get some control, and I think those stems were a little bit thicker and a little bit stiffer when we were using the CombCut in the wild mustard. One of the problems that we had with the CombCut is there's a few drains in the field. We lifted it up over the drains when we were using the CombCut, but we did end up hitting a clump of dirt with one of the knives, and because the knives are designed to kind of pop out of the CombCut, that knife popped out, hit a bunch of other knives, and then we had probably about 30 knives in a row that all came out of the CombCut. And it is challenging to put those knives back in the bar. It took a while to figure it out, but I think next time we use it, it'd be easier to figure out how to get those knives back in and what to do to prevent that from happening next time. So that would be one of the challenges I had with the CombCut. I don't know if that's something that could be rectified. I'm guessing there's a reason why they're in there like that and pop out. But overall, I was fairly satisfied with the CombCut, and I would really like to experiment it with it again in the future to see how we can get a better cut of plants like thistles and wild mustard. So, after using the CombCut, I think that there is definitely a place that I can see integrating it into weed control measures on the farm. And this fall, with being a dry fall, I'm hoping that we can get some control of the thistles, and then, based on what we see next spring, make a decision in terms of, I'm hoping to plant a flax crop, but if the weed conditions and the soil fertility conditions don't allow it, I would just go back to a green manure and try hard to get a better control of some of the thistles and wild oats that we've seen on the farm.
So here we are back in our organic oat field in Carmen, Manitoba. This is some of the University of Manitoba's plot work that we have been doing. In this area, we've used two forms of mechanical weed control. We've used the Garford camera-guided inter-row cultivator, which was applied early in June, and we've used the CombCut probably around the second week of July. So this field's divided up into two sections. In the section that I'm standing in right now, we use the CombCut mostly for thistle management, and so you can see behind me this strip we didn't use the CombCut at all, so there's still quite a substantial number of thistles that have risen above the crop canopy. So where I'm standing right now, we've used the CombCut west to east, and we've used the Garford inter-row cultivator on the west side of the field and not on the east side. So if you look into the canopy, you can see that on the section where we have used the Garford inter-row cultivator, the inter-row spaces are relatively weed-free. We do have some green foxtail, late emerging green foxtail, but the majority of it is in the crop row. And on the other portion of the field where we've only used the CombCut, but no Garford inter-row cultivation, you can see that there is still adequate thistle management. However, the inter-row spaces have a higher density of green foxtail as well as other broadleaf weeds. If we look at the thistle patch itself, where no CombCut at all was applied, on the section where we used an inter-row cultivator on the left side, you can see that the thistles are much more sparse and tend to be within the crop row itself. But in the area where there was no CombCut or no inter-row cultivation, the density of the thistles is much higher than where we only had one tool, and substantially higher where we've used two. So you can see on this thistle here, we've had an initial cut, and two, either at the time smaller stems or new stems have regrown. Despite this, the flowers are much further behind than what we see in the untouched thistle patch, and also not as vigorous as the thistles that hadn't been cut at all. Some thistles where we were able to completely cut off all stems, we see that there's no regrowth whatsoever. This is an area of the field that we set the CombCut quite aggressively. So you can see that while we had excellent thistle control, we used the CombCut right in the middle of a big thistle patch, that the oats definitely experienced some crop damage and have been slower at recovering from that crop damage. If we look into the thistle patch, the oats within that patch are quite a bit taller than the ones we've seen here. However, despite the substantial levels of crop damage, you can see that we did do substantial damage to the thistles as well, and there's been very little regrowth. While the thistles are still there within the crop canopy, for the majority of this area, the oats are above the thistles. So this is something that we need to think about when setting the CombCut. We did this more as an example, but there will always be that balance between crop damage and efficacious weed control. So in this type of scenario, we may have been causing substantial damage to the thistles, but we also most likely have taken a substantial yield penalty here as well. Okay, we are in an organic wheat field in Carmen, Manitoba at the University of Manitoba's research station. And what we can see here is we have used the CombCut a second time during the growing season. On this side, we lifted it above the crop canopy. The wheat obviously at this stage has a solid stem and fully formed seed. So at this point, we're mostly using it to manage weed seeds that may return to the weed seed bank and set seeds next year. And on this side is a strip where we've only used it once early in the season, but we haven't used it a second time above the crop canopy to manage much of the wild oats that we see here. This is just another way that you can use the CombCut at multiple stages throughout the growing season and for multiple purposes. So where those early season applications are really to give the crop more access to light and allow it to be more competitive, whereas the late season applications are more for managing the weed seed bank. A swather would achieve the same results as the CombCut would in regards to above canopy weed clipping. But where we would get the advantage in this case is having weeds clipped below the crop canopy much earlier in the season, making sure that crop has more access to space and light. Soybeans are another example of a crop in which you can use the CombCut. Soybeans are a little bit different because they're obviously a broadleaf crop. The mechanism of the CombCut, allowing it to move underneath the crop canopy, will not work for soybeans. But we used it here above the crop canopy to manage some of the thistles that were starting to grow above the soybeans. While these soybeans were also inter-row cultivated, you can see that there's still substantial weed pressure from the weeds that have been remaining in the row, which is why having other tools at your disposal like a CombCut or being able to even swath some of these weeds above the canopy are excellent ways to reduce weed pressure and to allow your crop to gain access to the light, which will make it more competitive for the remainder of the growing season.